Welcome to today's lecture. We're going to be talking about hood feminism. And I want to first of all just draw your attention towards the person whose interview we were looking at today, Miki Kendall. And I want to point out that the book that she wrote entitled Hood Feminism, from which we're going to be talking about today, was actually released this year. It was first in print in February of this year, which is interesting because that's right before both COVID hit as well as the shooting of Breonna Taylor. And so this interview that's taken just a few months after the release of this book actually has a few new things in it that make this interesting. And I'd point out, if you look at the full title, it's Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot. I think this is a very interesting book, especially in light of what we're going to be talking about with feminism today. But I wanted you to get a look at the author and this book in case you're interested in further developing your knowledge about hood feminism. To start off with, there's a number of different quotes that she has in this interview, a number of different things that she says. And I'd point out just three of these, if you look at them closely, seem to be very close to a lot of the points that Bell Hooks made in the essay that we read earlier this semester. And if we look at it, right, the first thing she's talking about here is that women have risen to these positions of being CEOs and have neglected the needs of Black women in things like food security and education and child care. She says that like this kind of academic view of feminism really sees Black women as these single mothers who are objects as opposed to people. And so, she says they're problems to solve instead of human beings with an equal kind of voice. And even, towards the end of this essay, I include this last kind of discussion that she has about how there's all these kind of hucksters that are out there to take advantage of something like people who call themselves feminists, that are willing to drop a lot of money to prove that they belong to the feminist crowd. And for her, the fact that this has become somewhat of a commercialized enterprise is suspicious itself. But the bigger kind of issue here is that the ability to turn something into a commercialized enterprise questions, in some sense, the meaning behind it. Because if it can be bought and sold as a brand, then what gives it any kind of definition or meaning behind that kind of brand? So one of the first questions that we could start off with in thinking about what hood feminism is, how this is a specific kind of brand, is to really think about how it's different than third wave feminism. Is this something unique, or is this just another iteration of something that we've already talked about? And so there's a couple of arguments that I would pose to help us think about the separation between hood feminism and some of the arguments that we uncovered in third wave feminism. And probably the most important argument, we touched on this a little bit last class period, but I think it's important to go back to it and think about it again, is like, what does the wave construction of feminism itself actually do for the movement of feminism? Like, who designed it? What's its purpose? And of course, one of the questions that we could look at, or one of the ideas that we could push, is that maybe the wave construction is really a design in the second wave feminism to empower white women. Because again, going with the point that Paula Gunn Allen makes about the fact that feminism in the United States actually has its roots in indigenous feminism first, and it's not the other way around. um, the waves of feminism have a way of empowering white upper class women in saying that, you know, they were the first to really take charge and to take ownership, and that other women came along afterwards. And so built within the wave structure is it's possible that each wave, each iteration of feminism is seen as this kind of hierarchy where, you know, first and second wave feminists were more pure in their ideals than the waves that came afterwards. And maybe it's a construction that helps write off the ideals and goals of the feminisms that come afterwards. And so that's one kind of way that we could differentiate between what we're going to be talking about today as hood feminism and third wave feminism. Another thing that we could look at is what feminism actually says about the hood itself. If there is a separation between feminism and hood feminism, or third wave feminism and hood feminism, then we have to look at, well, how is the hood described from a feminist standpoint? And, you know, is this an actual accurate portrayal of the hood? And Miki Kendall in this interview does, I think, a really good job of making that separation, and we'll talk about that. But then another thing that she says, and I just throw in the direct quote here, is about the shared relationship between low-income white women and low-income black women. And if you'll remember, Bell Hooks says in her essay that you know, class and race are inextricably tied together with each other, and the freedom of one necessitates the freedom of the other one. And I think it's interesting that Miki Kendall reiterates that in this interview that she has. And I think she actually takes it a step further than what Bell Hooks does. If you look at this last sentence in this quote, she says, "I know that they are often blamed for racism," that is, low-income white women, right, are often blamed for racism, but they don't have functionality, have any power to make racism as a structural oppression work. And that's an interesting claim, because what she's really getting after here is that you know, you can think about women who are poor, who are established as kind of you know, the stereotypical, you know, racist kind of like individual. And Miki Kendall is saying that, like, we shouldn't take a look at that as a stereotype, because that person doesn't actually have the power to create the systemic kind of problems that we see in society. Again, the functionality of racism itself actually works under people who have more power than poor white women. I was, you know, watching The Big Short a while back, and, you know, at the very end of it, Steve Carell's character talks about how when it's all said and done, the people who are going to be blamed for the massive you know, recession in 2008 are going to be the immigrants and poor people, and it's not going to be looked at as a problem of these you know, very irresponsible bankers that are handing out these mortgages that they have no backing for. And the end of the movie shows that, of course, that's exactly what happens. I mean, the same kind of light, Miki Kendall's pointing out the fact that when we want to talk about racism, it's easy to look at how poor people, you know, poor white women, and even, you know, probably poor white men in this category, how you know, they can be seen as racist. And again, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, that they're not. But the problem isn't, right, how many poor white women or how many poor white men are racist. The problem is the people who have power higher than them, that are enabling that racism, that are creating that racism in order to stay in power. And then the last kind of difference that I think is important to take a look at here between third wave feminism and hood feminism is, instead of just focusing on violence against women, which is an important part of third wave feminism. It's starting to be a part of second wave feminism, and the idea of recognition. If you remember the end of Simone de Beauvoir's essay, or the excerpts that we looked at, I should say, she talks about the ability for women to stand up for themselves and to be able to do violence against others as a right, as being a human being that men enjoy without even thinking about it, and that it's something that women have never been able to really do themselves. Hood feminism, from Mickey Kendall's standpoint, is really about not just focusing on violence against women per se, but looking at it through the lens of police brutality and gun violence, and particularly the interaction between both of those, which again I think is really interesting because this was released just a few weeks before the Breonna Taylor case came out. So again, those are some of the ways that we could differentiate between hood feminism and third wave feminism. But let's look at some of these arguments a little bit more closely so we have a decent idea of what hood feminism itself actually is. And I want to start by focusing on the very last one, the focus on police brutality and gun violence. It was in, I believe, 2015, where in McKinney, Texas, which is just a suburb of Dallas, Texas, the story broke out about this Texas police officer who, his name was Case Bolt, right, who showed up at this pool party where, there were both white and black people at the party, and this police officer was with another police officer. He dropped his flashlight, and these kids that were at the party were coming over to give the police officer the flashlight. There's kind of this 14-minute video footage of the police officer that you see here, where he very systematically ignores all of the white people who are there and starts telling the people who are black to get on the ground, right? The black male kids in particular. And then he goes over to this group of girls who are in their bikinis and tells them that they better get out of there. The kids who in fact were trying to return his flashlight are told to sit down on the ground and wait as he starts putting handcuffs on them. He pulls his gun out on these boys, but the craziest part of the video is that he slams this 14-year-old girl down to the ground as she's screaming, and he takes a situation that was not very chaotic and creates a lot of chaos itself. And actually, I want to point out within this story, I remember seeing in the news this particular phrase used a lot to describe the 14-year-old girl who was there. And this story changed and evolved very quickly, but this phrase of the bikini-clad 14-year-old girl was used repeatedly in describing the girl who was really just at a swimming party that she had been invited to. She was trying to hang out, and it was kind of one of those cases where it was just a white parent who didn't think that people of color should be in this neighborhood, and called the police on them. And the reason why I want to point out that phrase, the bikini-clad 14-year-old girl, is just because that's a very good example of how the narrative within media itself can be concerning. And going to this larger idea about hood feminism, it's a good example of how feminism, from a certain standpoint, has allowed narratives to take shape about women who are not necessarily white women. And again, that's not to say that white women don't suffer from sexism, that white women aren't cast as sexual objects, but there are specific sorts of phrases that are used, specific ideas that are embedded in society that make it, again, going to the way Bell Hooks describes it, that not all oppression is actually equal, right? Not all molding and shaping of women are targeted at the same group. And so, again, the discussion in hood feminism is, well, why is it that there are certain women, right, who fall, certain girls, in this case, right, who fall under the labels that society gives us, and other women are immune from those kinds of labels. And so again, just looking at this idea of the bikini-clad 14-year-old girl, it's interesting to see just how many different news agencies reported this incident exactly like that. What Mickey Kindle herself actually mentions in her book that I think is even more interesting than that example I provided for you is that she talks about how even before Breonna Taylor, you have lots of examples where police brutality affects Black women in a way that it doesn't affect other women, and in a way it doesn't affect other people. And so, she starts off this premise by pointing out the fact that, like, if Tamir Rice, who is a 12-year-old playing in the park by himself, is not immune to police brutality, in this instance, being shot by the police and dying from that, within 4 minutes of being shot, then obviously other Black women are not going to be immune either. And so she uses the example of Rakia Boyd, and this is a very interesting story because, for one thing, Mickey Kindle is herself from Chicago. She lived in Chicago for a while. But what makes this story really interesting is that it came out at a time when a lot of other stories about Black men gained national attention. So this was close to the time when the Eric Garner video came out, and that's the one where there's about 11 different police officers sitting around and choke a man. But the Rakia Boyd story did not actually gain the national sorts of attention, and it kind of went away. But it was this very interesting story about an off-duty officer. His name was Dante Servin, and Dante, like I said, was not on duty. He shot Rakia Boyd from his car. Witnesses say that he looked drunk, and he questioned Rakia Boyd's friends in a kind of offbeat like manner. He later testified that he thought someone had a gun, but of course no gun was recovered from them, and other people identified that maybe this was a cell phone that he was looking at. But the reason why Mickey Kindle mentions this is because this seems like a very scandalous kind of a story, and yet it didn't gain a lot of attention. I'm sure if you read through this part, you might have even asked yourself, like, who, right? Like, who was this person? And what's even more interesting about the case is that the prosecutor charged involuntary manslaughter instead of first-degree murder. And there's really no understanding of why that's the case, because this doesn't seem to be any different than any person who would drive in a neighborhood, get out of their car and shoot somebody. Again, the police officer wasn't on duty. They hadn't been called to take care of anything. And like I said, a lot of witnesses described the police officers, Dante Servin, as being drunk. right, or acting consistent in a manner that seemed like he was drunk. She also mentions this story about Daniel Holtzclaw, which is also a very interesting story, again, about a police officer. And in this case, I want to show you on this next slide that all of the different counts that Daniel Holtzclaw was eventually accused of. All total, 13 women accused him of something like 36 different charges. He was convicted on 18 different counts of sexual assault that involved 8 different women. And I want to show you on this next slide those 8 counts. This is from the Wikipedia, so I'll just let you know that up front. But each one of these are incidences in which the jury, considered what Mr. Holtzclaw was doing. And if you look at each one of these, there's a very kind of clear pattern where Holtzclaw is not on duty, but in his police car pulls over a woman and basically accuses her of doing something. In some cases, just by being a police officer, tells the woman to perform oral sex on her or on him, and then ends up raping the victim. And as you can see, like in the June accounts, right, some of them were as young as 17 years old. Some of them were as old as the next day, if you see, 57 years old. And in each of these cases, what is interesting is that all of the women were Black. Every last one of them. One of his kind of like marks was that he would tell them afterwards that if they accused him, no jury would believe them because they were Black. And so why Miki Kendall focuses on this part in her interview is because she says, before Breonna Taylor was shot in her home by a squad of police officers who were on duty. We have this list of crimes against Black women by off-duty police officers where nothing really happened. In this case, Holtzclaw was, like I said, convicted of these charges and sentenced to something like, I think, 263 years in jail. But again, it's after going through 13 different victims, and what was crazy is by the end of the second year of 2015, I believe that there was 36 women total who came forward and had some sort of report about sexual harassment. Interestingly enough, Brett Hankinson, who was the officer involved in the Breonna Taylor shooting, who was gone for a whole hour after the shooting occurred and then came back to the scene of the crime, also has quite a few women who have accused him of acting in a manner that is completely consistent with this same police officer. He is the one that was acquitted and was charged with shooting carelessly into the apartment, and he has since also found employment in another police department in Kentucky. And so Miki Kendall's making the point that if we're taking the rights of women seriously, and we're talking about all women, as feminism would have us believe, then how come there's no outrage about these particular kinds of cases? Again, before the Breonna Taylor case even came to light, why is there not a focus on these women's rights as well? And the obvious answer is because from her standpoint, feminism doesn't represent all women. Feminism represents a certain group of women. So again, one of the other differentiations that we could make about this type of feminism versus some of the other waves of feminism that we've looked at is a description about, well, how does feminism actually see the hood itself? And one quote that she gives about this is saying that people see the hood as this kind of terrible place. I mean, she says no one takes care of anyone, and you're out there struggling by yourself. The reality for poverty, whether you're in the inner city or rural area, is that you are with your community all the time. You're all working together because otherwise you're not going to make it. And again, I think this is an interesting idea behind hood feminism, in the sense that there is a larger idea of community that's not necessarily built into what we'd see as the third wave structure. Even though the third wave structure wants to have all women have a seat at the table, and becomes massively more inclusive than any wave of feminism beforehand, and arguably even more inclusive than perhaps fourth wave feminism afterwards. There's still not a focus on the meaning of community, particularly when you're impoverished. And contrast this with how communities that are oppressive have been able to band together in the United States. One of the other things that she says in the interview is that if you live in a place that's all white, or 99% white, that doesn't happen by accident. And again, she makes this statement, right? When you say that my town has no problem with racism, you're choosing ignorance at the expense of other people. In other words, she's pointing out the fact that if a place truly wants to be diverse and truly has goals and ideals that allow for diversity, that's going to attract more people than just white people somewhere. And if by default, right, you always assume that your standards are the standards of everybody else, then it's going to be extremely exclusive. Just a really kind of quick example of this is if you look at churches, a lot of white churches play music that's based on the guitar. Like if you go to any white church, be like, what is the most essential instrument that you have for playing like worship music? You'll hear almost like repeatedly like the guitar. The guitar is really important. But by the same token, if you go into a black church, right, and you ask the same question, like what is the most essential instrument that you have out of like all the things that are here, the answer will most likely be like the piano. Like the piano is really the indispensable sort of thing. And so if you mix these ideas together, right, and you say, well, I want a diverse church, like what that will mean is that there's a compromise between those things. And you could easily see where a church is trying to be diverse and reaching out to other people and isn't successful about that, right? Week after week, they're playing on their guitars and they're like, I don't understand why we're not more diverse than like what we are. And that's just a quick kind of throwaway example. But there's other ways in which this is true. Think about school dress codes and how many of them are designed to where, if you wear your hair in an afro, right, like you are basically considered like a criminal, right, or how some dress codes serve the interests of men, right, like over women. Again, Miki Kendall's more or less making the point that like this doesn't happen by accident. It's thought out, and it's something that is meant to be exclusive, so that again there's only really one kind of person that's included. And so she says, right, it's not that feminism doesn't know better, right? It's not that like if you have a conscious raising group and every time you have 30 white women show up and you never have anything different show up. It's not that the people in that group don't realize this isn't very diverse, right? But it's the second statement, right? I think feminism doesn't want to do better all the time. Like maybe you're satisfied with that. Right? You say, hey, I've got 30 people showing up. Like, why do I need this group to be like more diverse? Like we're handling women's issues. And so being able to sit back and critically think about like, well, are you actually considering women's issues, or are you considering a special group of women's issues? Something else I'd point out about this notion of hood feminism that she really brings out in her book is also that I think she might have said this in the interview as well, that like when like feminism fails her, it's the hood that comes in for her, right? It's like you can read these very academic kind of arguments about like sisterhood and like we're going to defeat the patriarchy, but at the end of the day, it's the people who you make a connection with that make a community. And for her, the hood has always been there for her, and these other kind of academic arguments have not, right? And the people who make those kinds of arguments have been willing to bail out on her. So again, looking at this, the brand of hood feminism that she's talking about here. One of the differences that could be made is just simply that sense of community that seems to be lacking. And it's interesting because if we go back to what Bell Hooks says in her discussion about feminism as well, she mentions this as a problem in the conscious raising groups that she's going to, right? Is that there isn't the sense of sisterhood that's preached. That means the same sort of ideal she has about sisterhood compared to what the women who are trying to embrace this notion think it is. What I want to focus to finish out on, however, is this connection that she talks about between poor women and looking at the double bind that Simone de Beauvoir sets up and talking about how women have to choose between motherhood and their professional life, and that you can always be seen as choosing wrong, right? A woman who chooses to have children and have a professional career as seen as like this bad mother. And the woman who chooses to have children and stay at home is like made to be like a gold digger, and like the woman, right, who chooses not to have children is made to be seen as like not a legitimate woman like to begin with, right? Or lesbian or something along those lines, right? It's like not an actual choice that she made, right? But infertility or something like along those lines. And what I want to point out is that the same thing is actually true of double binds that poor women face. And I think that the ending part that she talks about here, she mentions a lot of other communities in her like kind of like final thoughts. So she talks about like how trans women like need a voice like as well. But if we focus on this particular brand of hood feminism, she says in her interview this about childcare. She says, childcare subsidies are an often neglected part of the conversation around public assistance. If we want women to be empowered to work, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have to make it possible for them to be able to go to work, even if they have children. And this is one shared trait of poor women that I think is an interesting part of the notion of hood feminism. Is because, first of all, if you are a poor person, then you are most likely working a job like a McDonald's like kind of job. And what I mean by that is that being able to choose between taking care of your children and doing your job is not always really a choice. So, if you are working as, say, a McDonald's worker, and again, I do not mean anything disparagingly by the way I'm about ready to talk about this, but the amount of money that you make as a McDonald's worker does not allow you to be able to seek good childcare. And in fact, in an instance like we're in right now during COVID-19, there are a lot of women who they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place because they're having virtual school, and so their children are at home while they have to go to work. And there's not really a good way of making that kind of situation work. I imagine some of you are the default caretakers for maybe your siblings, right, in this situation where it's like you have to help take care of your family members while other family members like go off to work or vice versa. And so the ends, like, kind of bottom line part of that is the fact that you don't have a lot of money once you take out childcare. You don't have a lot of money left over if you're working a job as like a McDonald's worker. And so, like, what kind of food are you left to be able to buy for like your children that you have to like be able to give them? And it's like, like steaks and vegetables would be wonderful, but those are really expensive. And the cheaper kind of food that you can give your kids are like the sugar-induced kind of like food, right? And so it's like, are you going to go out and buy asparagus that costs like $3 like for like a bundle, or are you going to buy, right, like the chocolate chip cookies, right, for like breakfast? And of course, like, you could go through like a whole assortment of ideas here, right? Like cereal and like waffles and syrup and like Pop-Tarts, right? Like all of that stuff is significantly cheaper than, again, like, wholesale kind of like broccoli or, organic vegetables. And really, as you start thinking out like the healthier kind of like options, it's almost impossible for somebody who's working a job at McDonald's to be able to send their kids to a place where they get decent child care and be able to feed them and still be able to pay all the other bills that exist out there. And so you start seeing yourself in these kinds of double binds where, yeah, a pandemic sweeps through. And so it's like, are you going to be the bad mother who lets their children stay at home, right, while you go and work? Are you going to be the lazy person who decides to give up their, their job so that you can stay at home with like your children during the pandemic? And of course, like the questions about things like food stamps and things like that, come up as well. And what Miki Kendall really points out in this is that like poor women share this in common. And it's an experience that a lot of poor women have to go through. It's a double bind that poor women constantly find themselves in. To think about this in another way, I know someone who has like a very good job, like a nice middle class kind of job, but her brother is a doctor. Right? Her brother makes an insane amount of money every year because he specializes in something that very few people in this area actually specialize in. Right? Now, when their mother got a cancer diagnosis, which of those two do you think took care of that mother, and helped her through her cancer? Was it the one that had a okay, like middle class kind of job, or was it the one who made insane amounts of money, right, working as a specialized doctor in one field? And of course, it was, right, the middle class like person, because she's a woman, right, and she's supposed to take care of her mother in those sorts of situations. And women are placed in this position all the time. Right, where it's not women who are not making child supports child support payments, right, to the fathers. It's the other way around, as women become the default caretakers, right, like for their children. And again, I'm not saying that that shouldn't be the case, right? But as that happens, that also strains the amount of money that they can spend on other things. And that, of course, requires them to not only take care of their other family members, their children, and so on and so forth, right? But it also requires them to give up what Simone de Beauvoir talks about in The Second Sex, right? That there are opportunities for advancement in their other careers. Right? While the men who are being delinquent on child support payments, right, are free to climb the career ladder as much as they possibly want to. They do not have to be seen as, bad fathers because they're not choosing between these, like, healthy or unhealthy kind of options like a food. They're not in their child's lives like at all. And so, coming back to the point about hood feminism, one of the other ideas that we could talk about here is the special kinds of double bind situations that poor women find themselves in, that richer women are not really capable of understanding because they haven't had to go through those different kinds of experiences. I mean, just think about a daycare for a moment. This is for me, I remember it's one of the most heartbreaking things that ever happened. There was a time where I had to have my son go to a daycare facility. I remember seeing just like 40-ish kinds of like kids, right, in a like this small kind of like tight room, right, and my son like telling me right before I like left, like, don't go, don't go. And people who are richer, like, they don't have to deal with like that kind of dynamic. Like, you can just hire a nanny to come to your house. You don't have to drop them off or leave them if like you don't want to. The whole situation is completely different. And a person who hires a nanny may see in themselves, right, somebody who had to drop their kids off at daycare, right, and may think those experiences are similar, but in fact they're completely different things. And so, looking at the larger kind of picture here of hood feminism, it really boils down to not just a distinction from third wave feminism with some newly defined kinds of goals, but it's also in some ways a description about how the notion of feminism up to this point has been a failure because it hasn't taken into account the idea of what it means to be in the hood, and that hasn't taken into account the experiences of women who are poor. I think if you were really to analyze some of the other arguments that she makes about gun violence and police brutality, you might also see a relationship here between other groups of women who are poor. Paula Gunn Allen in The Sacred Hoop talks in a very similar kind of manner about police who come onto the reservation and continuously rape women on the reservation, and who have immunity from being charged with that because the space on the reservation is considered to be its own type of sovereignty. Even though the police are held as the principality over that sovereignty in criminal situations, sometimes they are immune from being charged with anything because it is a separate sovereignty, like within that nation. And Paula Gunn Allen talks about how this is, abused through several different generations of Indian women. And so we see that same dynamic playing out in Miki Kendall's description here as well. And I could imagine that there are other accounts from immigrant populations where probably a very similar dynamic has taken root as well. People who are given authority over immigrant women, right, to maintain their legal status in the United States. I imagine there are similar stories here. Thank you for listening, and that concludes for now our discussion on hood feminism and our larger discussion on feminism in general. Thank you and have a great day.